Hello, and welcome to the Wednesday class. Today is Lesson 7, which is Judges chapter 7, the continuation of the story of Gideon. But before we get into that, let us go ahead and open with some prayer. Most gracious and loving God, we thank you for all the gifts that you give to us. Watch over us today, guide our minds, guide our spirits. Give us wisdom and understanding into what we read and how we apply that to our lives today. And in all things, watch over us and protect us and be part of our lives as we call you into our presence today. And in all things, we praise your name and we praise your blessings that you give to us. And we thank you for all the gifts you give. Amen. Kind of a recap. As chapter 6 began, we found out again that the people had turned their backs on God and had gone back to worshiping the Baals and the Asherahs. Well, that allowed, what that did is, it of course irritated God, and God then allowed the Midianites to harass and oppress the Israelites for about 7 years. What they would do is they would come in along with the Amalekites and some other eastern peoples, and they'd come in and they would steal the crops or destroy the crops. They'd bring in their camels and all of their herds and just really mess up the area and take away all the Israelites' food. And so in a lot of ways they were starving the Israelite people. The Israelites would grow their crops, and the Midianites and the Amalekites and these eastern people would come in and just take it away from them after they had grown their crops. They would also harass them enough that they were hiding most of the time. Instead of staying in their homes, they were creating dugouts and hideouts and stronghold places where they could protect their food or protect themselves from these invading people. So they were kind of reduced to starvation and hiding in all that they did. And so after 7 years, or this period of time has elapsed, they cry out to God, and God sends first a prophet and an angel. He sends the prophet who tells them, here is what God has called into being because of your failure to follow, because of your inability to follow God, or follow me, as God would say. And instead you follow these Baals and the Asherahs, that I am going to allow them to come in and do this to you. Then the angel appears. An angel appears in the story, and he sits under the great tree in Ophrah, which belongs to Joash, which is Gideon's father. That's where the angel sits, and in the next scene, we see that the angel confronts Gideon himself, and because what we see is Gideon, and this is really strange. Gideon here is threshing wheat in a wine press, at the wine press, and that's just kind of an odd thing to do. What we need to recognize too is as we move the story forward, the fleece, which is later in the story as we're doing this recap, the fleece that comes up. He was threshing wheat on the wine press, and he was messing with sheep's wool at the threshing floor. So he never seems to do the things that he's supposed to do in the places he's supposed to do them. He does things in inappropriate places. It's just kind of one of Gideon's things, I guess. Well, he's threshing wheat at the wine press where he meets the angel, or the angel comes and meets him. Tells him that he's the one that's been called up to lead the people out of this oppression. He's the one that's supposed to do this for them. And of course he needs proof. And Gideon then says, okay, well let me go and get you a gift, or go get you a present. And he runs off and he creates he makes some bread, and he cooks down some meat, and he has the broth, and he brings this to the angel. And again, looking for proof that this is truly from God. The angel says, okay, fine, put the meat over here on this rock, pour the broth out on the rock, put the bread on the rock, and the angel then puts his staff toward the rock, and all the stuff is consumed, and that's proof that should be enough proof to Gideon that this is actually an angel from God. The angel tells him that he needs to go ahead and take down the altar to Baal and cut down the Asherah pole. So gathering 10 of other people, he goes in the middle of the night and takes care of this. And he pulls down the Baal altar to Baal, and he pulls down the Asherah, cuts down the Asherah pole. And in fact, he uses the wood from the Asherah pole to sacrifice a bull. Now he's told to bring 2 bulls. The first bull pulls everything apart. That's the bull that takes all the stuff down. But you don't want to have the bull that you did all the work with to be the sacrificial bull, because the bull that did all the work might have gotten injured somewhere along the way, got a scratch on it, got something happened. And so he has also the 7-year-old bull brought up. Now what's interesting is that the 7 years, the 7-year-old bull correlates or corresponds with the 7 years of oppression that the Israelites went through because of Midian. And so there's a 1 year on this bull for every year they have been under this oppression. And that's just kind of it's just part of the story that we need to recognize, is that there was actually a reason why it was a 7-year-old bull. Because there is nowhere in Levitical laws, there's nowhere in the Jewish law structure or in their feast structure or in their sacrificial structure for a 7-year-old bull. There's nothing specific about that. So the 7 years has absolutely everything to do with how long they had been under the oppression. So he's pulled down the Asherah pole. He's taken down the Asherah pole. He's pulled down the altar. He's made a sacrifice of this bull on his new altar of undressed stone. He built an altar there of undressed stone, which is what he's supposed to do, where he sacrificed the bull. People in the town see that this has happened, and they're pretty upset by this. So they look to find out, okay, who did this? And they start searching around. They start asking questions of other villagers, other people in the village. And it comes down to, well, Gideon did it. So they come and they confront Gideon. And, well, actually they come and confront Gideon's father, Joash. And Joash says basically, well, let Baal defend himself. Let Baal defend himself. And they give Gideon a new name, which is Joreb Baal, which means let God, or let Baal contend, or let Baal defend himself. Let Baal defend. And so Gideon gets a new name. The people are afraid to, well, they're not afraid, but they're talked out of trying to stone him or burn him at the stake or whatever. And he receives a new name for this. Now, what we need to recognize, too, is that Gideon's name itself means to hew down. Gideon means to hew down, to cut down. And so Gideon's name in both instances, whether it's Jerub-Baal or whether it's Gideon, it has to do with this god, Baal. Either they cut down the Asherah pole, pull down the altar, which is where he gets his name as being Gideon. And also the fact that he did this to let, if Baal is so strong, then Baal can contend with Gideon himself. So Gideon is relatively okay with this now, and what we find out then that after this happens, then Midian, the Midianites, the Amalekites, and the eastern people, they move into the area. So while all of this other stuff was happening now the Midianites, the Amalekites, and the eastern people have started to move into the area again, and they've camped in the valley of Jezreel, below the Mount of Moriah. And so that's what's happened here. And then Gideon, again, this is all from last week, then Gideon calls his own tribe of the Abirazites. He calls his own tribe, and they respond, or his own clan, and then they respond. And then he calls out to Manasseh and Asher and Zebulun and Naphtali and asks them to come in and join with the fight. And altogether he gathers 32,000 members of the Israelite people, of the Hebrews. He gathers 32,000 soldiers to take care of this problem. But before the battle begins, Gideon needs more affirmation that this is actually God working. And so he has a test done. And the test is the wet fleece or the dry fleece. So he, again, here takes place on the threshing floor. What he's doing with wool fleece on a threshing floor is beyond me. Again, he never seems to do things in the proper place. And so what he does is it's a twofold test. On the first day, he puts the fleece out there on the threshing floor. Now you know that the threshing floor has an open ceiling because it's supposed to be on top of a hill, so the wind will take away the chaff and just leave the grain. And so this is on top of a hill, and it's an open space like this. And so he lays the fleece out there, and the next morning he gets up. The fleece is wet, but the ground all around it is dry. And he says, okay, God, don't be angry at me, but one more test. And so the next night what he does is he lays the fleece out there, and what he does is he asks God, well, if this is truly you, then have the ground be wet and the fleece itself be dry, the opposite of what happened last night. And that's what happens. He wakes up in the morning, and the ground is wet and the fleece is dry. And so Gideon has his proof again that God is on his side. There is another little aspect of that little bit right there of the dew on the ground, the dry fleece, wet ground, dry ground test, is really not a test of God's ability so much as a proof that God is stronger than or bigger than or better than Baal. Baal is supposed to be the god of the dew. He's the god of thunder, he's the god of rain, he's the god of all these other things, but he's also very specifically the God in charge of dew, of that wetness that comes down in the morning. And so if God, our God, if Adonai can do this, then he beats Baal. Our God beats Baal. And that's what that test really is all about. We find out at the end of that chapter, the end of chapter 6, that Gideon has raised an army of 32,000 against an army of 135,000. And so he's outnumbered approximately 4 to 1. And that's where we pick up today with chapter 7. So, chapter 7, beginning with verse 1. Then Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and all the troops that were with him rose early and encamped beside the spring of Harod. And the camp of Midian was north of them, below the hill of Moriah in the valley. So as our story begins today, we have that, you need to note that right off the bat, right here, right at the very first two words in our chapter today, we have his other name, Jerubbaal. Let Baal contend. And so we have, and then in parentheses, that is Gideon. And again, so let Baal contend and let the hewer begin. That is Jerubbaal and Gideon. Well, he's gathered his 32,000 troops with him, and he rises early in the morning, and they encamped beside the spring of Harod, or Herod. But the spring of Harod, which is again very interesting, is Harod means trembling. The base of Harod is at the base of Mount Gilboa, and Mount Gilboa is an extinct volcano, or is a dead volcano, and every once in a while the ground around there trembles, and so Harod, the spring of Harod, means the spring of trembling, which is just again part of the story, is that the Gideonites, the followers of Gideon and Gideon himself, are very fearful about all of this. Now remember, and in some ways maybe they have a right to be. They are outnumbered 4 to 1 by the Midianites. But this is the situation that they're in, and so again this name here, Harod, fits with the scene, is because they are trembling. The Gideonites, the followers of Gideon, are afraid of the Midianites and the Amalekites that are camped near them. They're both, this is also, this just so you know, this all takes place inside or in the area that's known as the Valley of Jezreel, which we talked about last week a little bit. One of the other things, too, is that I want you to know, and the name will pop up here pretty soon because I've already mentioned it and it hasn't been written into our text yet, but Mount Gilboa, which is coming up in our story, I'll give you just a little background, or actually a little future ground of what's going to happen on Mount Gilboa. In the time of Saul, King Saul, just prior to David receiving the throne, there was a battle with the Philistines right there on top of Mount Gilboa. This was Saul's final attempt to drive the Philistines out of his territory. And of course Saul fails and Saul dies. This is the first monarch of Israel, of what is supposed to be the entirety of Israel. It's not at the time, but it's supposed to be. Saul is the first king to die, but he's also the first king to die of his own sword. And so he dies by suicide on Mount Gilboa, along with Jonathan, his favorite son, and two of his other sons. All three die on Mount Gilboa. But again, that happens far into the future. But Mount Gilboa plays a prominent role in that story, more so than this one. But Mount Gilboa gets mentioned here, and it'll come along very shortly. So, picking up now with verse 2. The Lord said to Gideon, "The troops with you are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hand. Israel would only take the credit away from me, saying, 'My own hand has delivered me.' Now, therefore, proclaim this in the hearing of the troops. Whoever is fearful and trembling, let him return home." Thus Gideon sifted them out. 22,000 returned, and 10,000 remained. So, here we are. He's got 32,000 troops there with him, and he's facing an army of 135,000. And God comes to him there at the trembling at Harod, there at the spring of trembling, and he says to Gideon, "You know, there's just too many troops here, because if you attack here and win, you, the Israelites, you, the people, will take all the credit instead of giving me, God, the credit. And I want the credit in this. I want you to understand that the only reason that you're winning, the only reason that you're going to be able to drive out the Midianites and the Amalekites and these eastern people is because I did it. God did it. I, your God, did this. Not your power, but my power was able to do this." And so he tells him that there's just way too many troops here for this. Because if you use this many troops, you're just going to take credit. And so I'm going to cut this down here. And so what I want you to do, and this actually follows along with Deuteronomic laws, the Levitical laws of the Torah, is that if they're too afraid to fight, they're allowed to go home. And so he says, okay, therefore, anyone who wants to go, anyone who's afraid of the battle here, anyone who is trembling, who is fearful and trembling, who's standing here beside the spring of trembling, you're allowed to go home. Well, 22,000 of his troops decide, yes, I want to go home. And so that left him 10,000 troops. 10,000 remained. That's quite a bit of number still, but now he's outnumbered, even more so. It's like 13 to 1 now. He has 10,000, the other side has 135,000. That's a lot of difference there. And so, let's see what happens. Picking up with verse 4. Then the Lord said to Gideon, "The troops are still too many. Take them down to the water, and I will sift them out for you there. When I say, 'This one shall go with you,' he shall go with you. And when I say, 'This one shall not go with you,' he shall not go." So he brought the troops down to the water, and the Lord said to Gideon, "All those who lap the water with their tongues, as a dog laps, you shall put to one side. All those who kneel down to drink, putting their hands to their mouths, you shall put to the other side." The number of those that lapped was 300, and all the rest of the troops knelt down to drink water. Then the Lord said to Gideon, "With the 300 that lapped, I will deliver you, and give the Midianites into your hand. Let all the others go to their homes. So he took the jars of the troops from their hands and their trumpets, and he sent all the rest of Israel back to their own tents, but retained the 300. The camp of Midian was below him in the valley. So, 10,000 troops is still too many. And God says to Gideon, you know, there's just still too many of them. You're going to still take credit for this if you do it with 10,000. So I've got another test for them. I want you to take them down to the creek here, take them down to the creek, to the Creek of Trembling, take them down to the Harod, and let them drink some water. And this is a test. And those that reach down in the water and pull the water up to their mouths and lap the water up like this, put on one side. And those that stick their face down into the water and lap it up that way, put them on the other side. So he chooses between these two. And all of those over here that brought the water up to their mouths were 300. And those that stuck their face in the water were the rest. So he sends that group, those that stuck their face down into the water, he sends them home, and he keeps the 300 that brought the water up to their face. And you say, oh, that's weird. Why is that? Well, let's think about this a little bit. If you are you're thirsty, you've been marching all day, and you come to a spring, and you sit down beside the spring, and you know the enemy is within not too far away. But instead of being careful, instead of bringing it up and showing caution even, by bringing the water up to your mouth so you can still look around, you stick your face in the water to drink it up from down here, from down at the creek. You're not showing any fear. You're not showing any. You're not showing that you maybe. You're not showing any fear. You're not showing any caution at all. And so those are the ones that are sent home, and only the ones that showed caution. Again, it's interesting is that those are the ones that were saved, the ones that were retained, the ones that are going to actually do this battle, are the ones who showed the most fear throughout this whole thing. They're the ones who brought it up here so they could look around and see what was going on. And I agree that as a soldier, that is a much better way of doing it. As someone who served in the Marines, I know that if I were to come to the creek, that's exactly how I would do it, because I would be cautious about the enemy being around me. And so battle awareness is important. And so in some ways, that is the smart choice. But in other ways, that is the fearful choice. The ones that were sticking their face in the water were braver, in some sense, than those that brought the water up to their mouths. And so God chose those that were most trembling, the least likely to win the battle, the most likely to run away when the battle begins. And so that's just kind of that's the test that God put out there. And that's an interesting test. Let me bring the most fearful with you. Well, that's exactly what happens. So he narrows it down. The number that were lapped was 300, but the rest of the troops he goes on sends home. So he sends home 9,700 troops. But I want you to note here at the bottom of at the end of this section here is he sends them home, but he sends them to their own tents. Now we've talked about this before in our class, but I don't think I've mentioned it here, is that to your tents, whenever that's spoken, means go to your place where you keep your weapons, to get your battle self ready, to get your warrior self ready, because we're going to war. To your tents means go get your equipment. Go get your battle equipment. Go get your warfighting tools. That's what to your tents means. And so when he sends all the rest back to their own tents, it is not, and we'll see this as the story progresses, we'll see that this isn't to send them home permanently, but it's actually to send them home in preparation for a bigger battle which is going to come. That's the difference. So, as those 9,700 troops are heading back to their tents to go get their weapons, to get themselves ready for a different kind of battle than what is going to happen here in this place, in this time, those that leave, they each one of them had a jar, and each one of them had a torch. Well, not each one of them, but the way these armies were structured was that you would have a torch bearer, and behind him would be 100, 200, 300 troopers, 300 other, 100 other soldiers behind him, another the military unit. That the torch itself represents a unit. So each one of those 9,000, or each one of those unit leaders hands the torch to one of the 300. And so all of the 300 now have torches. All of the 300 have jars, empty jars, that they put over the torch to hide the torch, so it's dark and so you can't see it. And so they've got the torch inside of this clay jar, and they have their trumpet. So they have their trumpet in their right hand, and they've got their clay jar and their torch in their left hand, and that's how they are going to go meet the enemy. Picking up now with verse 9. That same night the Lord said to him, "Get up, attack the camp, for I have given it into your hand. But if you fear to attack, go down to the camp with your servant Purah, and you shall hear what they say, and afterward your hands shall be strengthened to attack the camp." Then he went down with his servant Purah to the outpost of the armed men that were in the camp. The Midianites and the Amalekites and all the people of the east lay along the valley as thick as locusts, and their camels were without number, countless as the sand on the seashore. When Gideon arrived, there was a man telling a dream to his comrade, and he said, "I had a dream, and in it a cake of barley bread tumbled into the camp of Midian, and came to the tent, and struck it so that it fell. It turned upside down, and the tent collapsed." And his comrade answered, "This is no other than the sword of Gideon, son of Joash, a man of Israel. Into his hand God has given Midian and all the army." So on that same night that Gideon was given the instruction on what he was to do, he gets up. God tells him, or gives him instruction on what to do. Get up and attack the camp. But he says, in fact, get up and attack the camp, for I have already given it into your hand. But God gives Gideon another option too, because God knows that Gideon is absolutely fearful. He still has fear inside of him. He has not accepted the fact that God is going to allow all of this to happen. So, okay. And if you fear to attack, well, then I want you to do is I want you to go down, sneak down to the camp, take your servant Purah, 2 witnesses. Take your servant Purah with you, and go down there and listen and see if you can hear what they've got. Hear what's going on down there. And so, and maybe then your hand will be strengthened. Maybe then you'll stop trembling so much. Maybe then you'll find the courage. So that's what he does. He goes down to the camp. He sneaks down to where the enemy is, and he's hiding behind the tents, or he's hiding behind, but he overhears a conversation that just happens to happen at the same time that he arrives. God's providence at work here. God wanted him to hear this conversation. Well, we also told here, as the story is progressing, we also, again, it's reiterated how much, how many of the enemy are there, the Midianites and the Amalekites, how they're thick as locusts in the valley here. And they can't even count the number of camels that they have. It's an enormous army, and Gideon only has 300 men to fight it. And so, in some ways, I can understand his fearfulness, but at the same time, God keeps reassuring him, keeps showing him signs and wonders and magic to make him believe and help him to understand and help him to accept. But he doesn't. And so, He gets down there, and just at the time that he gets to the point where he arrived and he's hiding, he hears an Amalekite, or hears one of the eastern peoples talking about a dream that he had. And in the dream here, it's the cake of barley bread rolls down the hill and tumbles into the tent of the Midianites. And the tent is turned upside down, and the tent collapses. There's a Hebrew play. There's a word play here going on, and it's the word fell. And over again, it fell, and the double repeating of the word fell means it was an absolute collapse. It's the strength of the collapse, because it was a double falling kind of idea. And so in the Hebrew and the Aramaic, or in the original language, and even in the Greek as it was translated into the Greek, the idea of the double falling, which means it was a complete falling apart, that the tent collapsed. Well, his comrade, the other one who was listening to this telling of the dream, interprets the dream for him and tell him that, well, what you witnessed, that barley cake falling down the hill and collapsing the tent, is Gideon, the son of Joash, the man of Israel, and that God has given the Midianites into his hand. Now that's interesting. So we pick up now with verse 15. When Gideon heard the telling of the dream and its interpretation, he worshipped. And he returned to the camp of Israel and said, "Get up, for the Lord has given the army of Midian into your hand." After he divided the 300 men into 3 companies, and put trumpets into the hands of all of them, and empty jars with torches inside the jars, he said to them, "Look at me, and do the same. When I come to the outskirts of the camp, do as I do. When I blow the trumpet, I and all who are with me, then you also blow the trumpet around the whole camp, and shout, 'For the Lord and for Gideon.'" So Gideon heard the telling of the dream and the interpretation, and immediately he worships God. He worshipped. He returned, so he goes back to the camp, and he rouses his troops. "Get up! It's time. We're going to go to war. We're going to go to the battle." And the Lord is going to give the army of Midian into your hand. So he divides them up into 3 groups, or into 3 troops, into 3 companies. He puts everybody gets a trumpet, everybody gets a torch with a jar on the top, covering up the torch, a clay jar covering the torch. And he tells them, "I want you to watch what I do, and I want you to mimic, I want you to copy what I do. I want you to do exactly what I do. Look at me and do exactly the same. I'm going to go to the outskirts of the camp. We're going to surround the camp. And I'm going to blow my trumpet. And when I blow my trumpet, everybody blows their trumpets around the whole camp. And I want you to shout, 'For the Lord and for Gideon.'" Now here's the problem with that. I want you to remember that God very specifically wanted no one to get credit for this battle except God. That's what God wanted. God wanted nobody to get credit for this, including Gideon, for this battle. And what does Gideon say? "For the Lord and for Gideon" is what I want you to shout. Here's where the difference is. This is the beginning of the difference between the Moses story that we had, where Moses, remember I told you back in the last lesson that Moses and Gideon are parallel stories. There are things about one story that are the same as the other story, that there are words spoken that are almost identical throughout the whole story. This is the point where Gideon breaks from the Moses story and turns into a different character. At this point right here, "For the Lord and for Gideon," is where the story changes. If you were to go back and you were to look at the first 2 cycles in Judges here, you'd find that whenever the battle took place, it was always for the Lord. Rise up for the Lord. But here, Gideon says, for the Lord and for Gideon. That's what they are to shout. That is a difference. From verse 19. So Gideon and the 100 who were with him came to the outskirts of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch, when they had just set the watch. And they blew the trumpets and smashed the jars that were in their hands. So the 3 companies blew the trumpets and broke the jars, holding in their left hands the torches and in their right hand the trumpets to blow. And they cried, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." Every man stood in his place all around the camp, and all the men in the camp ran. They cried out and fled. When they blew the 300 trumpets, the Lord set every man's sword against his fellow and against all the army. And the army fled as far as Beth Shittah, toward Zerah, as far as the border of Abel Meheloah by Tabath. And the men of Israel were called out from Naphtali and from Asher and from all Manasseh, and they pursued after the Midianites. So, Gideon has, when he divided it up into 3 companies, he took one of the companies of 100, and he has 2 other companies, and each one of these companies have spread out, and they're surrounding the camp of the Midianites and the Amalekites and the eastern people. And so they've surrounded them with only 300 men, and there are 135,000 camped in this valley. Well, it's the beginning of the middle watch, and they had just set the watch. For those of us who serve in the military understand what this is that, or why this time was chosen. It's the same reason why Pearl Harbor was attacked at 8 o'clock in the morning. It's the change of the watch. And that's what exactly happens here, is it's at the change of the watch in the middle of the night, the midnight watch. What happens is that the people who are going off watch have just spent hours patrolling, walking around. They're tired. And they're a little worn out because they also had to work during the day, and so they had to wake up in the middle of the night to stand their watch, and now they get to go to bed, but they're tired, they're exhausted from the full day of work plus the hours they have just spent on watch. The new watch has just come on. They're still groggy from being asleep all day, or from being asleep. They haven't quite, they didn't get their full amount of sleep, but now they're being woken up and they're on watch. And so you have the off-going watch and the oncoming watch. Neither one of them are very effective. And so at that point, where 2/3 of your army is under, is stressed, or is under, or is tired and exhausted, or not really up to being fully ready, that's when Gideon chooses to attack. What he wants to happen, and so what he does is he blows his trumpet that were in his hands. He has his 100 men, and the other 300, and all 300 of them then blow their trumpets, and they break the jars with the torches on it. So what this shows is, okay, so you're the Midianites, you're the Amalekites, you're the eastern people, and you're in your camp, and you're asleep, and all of a sudden you hear this trumpet blowing, which you know is a battle cry. It's a call to battle. And so you hear the trumpets, and you hear 300 trumpets. That would be a lot of trumpets. That would be a lot of sound. The ram's horn would have been loud. And so, rousing from their tents, they would be running out, and they would see the torches. They would see the 300 torches all around them, and each one of those torches would represent anywhere from 100 to 1,000 men. Most likely, each one of those torches would represent 100 men, and there are 300 torches. So they would be looking at what they thought was an army that tripled their size. It was a 300,000 army instead of 300-man army, and so they would have been absolutely terrified that this is the way it is. That they're completely surrounded by 300,000 people, 3 times as many people as their soldiers as they have. So that's what happens. They yell out, they holler out, for the Lord and for Gideon, and they blow their trumpets and they smash their claws so everybody can see their torches. And what we hear is that every man, every one of them stood in their place. Now, if they've got, we got to picture this even fuller than I've already described it. If they have a torch in their left hand and a trumpet in their right hand, how are they throwing a sword? How are they lifting a sword? How are they attacking? They're not. They're standing. It says, every man stood in his place all around the camp. They didn't attack. They didn't have swords. They had trumpets and they had torches. They did not have any swords. So all of a sudden, every man stood in his place, and all of the men in the camp start running around. They cried out and they start to flee because they're afraid. They're completely surrounded by a vast army, is what they believe. And they start fleeing. And when they blow the trumpets, the Lord set every man's sword against his fellow and against all the army. They started fighting among themselves. They were so frightened, they saw the enemy in themselves, and they started attacking. And so they started killing each other. Blue on blue. So, this started happening, and this army, finally, the Midianite army, the Amalekites, and the eastern people, they break out of where they're encamped, and they start fleeing. And they flee as far as Beth Shittah, which is towards Zerera. In fact, I will show you on a map. There will be a map that will pop up here right now, which will show this place or how this is going. And as far as the border of Abel Meholah by Tabath. These are locations that are further south. And so they're headed southeast. And as they get there, or as they're moving in that direction, Gideon calls out and sends men out to, remember who he sent back to his tents, to your tents. He sent Naphtali and Asher and Manasseh and Zebulun and all of those. He sent them back to their tents. And so now Gideon sends messengers to Manasseh and Asher and Naphtali and calls them to, all right, bring the sword and pursue them. And so that's what happens. Manasseh and Zebulun and Naphtali, they raise up their, and Asher, they raise up, they leave their tents with their swords, and now they have weapons. And they go and they attack the fleeing Midianites. So picking up now with verse 24. Then Gideon sent messengers throughout all the hill country of Ephraim, saying, come down against the Midianites and seize the waters against them, as far as Beth Barah, and also the Jordan. So all the men of Ephraim were called out, and they seized the waters as far as Beth Barah, and also the Jordan. They captured the two captains of Midian, Oreb and Zeb. They killed Oreb at the rock of Oreb, and Zeb they killed at the winepress of Zeb, as they pursued the Midianites. They brought the heads of Oreb and Zeb to Gideon beyond the Jordan. So in our final segment of this story, Gideon sends also messengers out to Ephraim. So Manasseh and Asher and Zebulun have come, and they're pursuing the Midianites, and now Gideon calls up the Ephraimites, calls up the tribes of Ephraim. And Ephraim also sends out troops. But Ephraim is told, Ephraim holds that the eastern edge here in this particular story. And the idea here is that all the way to the Jordan. And Ephraim is to cut off the ability for the Midianites and the Amalekites and the eastern people to escape. He's supposed to cut them off. So he goes to the place that's mentioned here, the waters at Beth Barah. These are shallow areas. This is a shallow area of the Jordan where the Jordan isn't quite as deep. This would be the place where they would cross the Jordan onto the other side. And Ephraim is there to cut them off from that. And so in the process of all of this, they capture two of the commanders of the armies of the Midianites and the Amalekites, and the eastern peoples, they capture and kill 2 of their leaders. Now these wouldn't be the kings of the Midianites or the Amalekites or anything. These would just be field commanders, and they captured 2 of the field commanders. One of them is named Oreb, and Oreb means raven. And so they captured the raven, and Zeb is a wolf. So they captured the raven and the wolf. They killed the raven at the rock of Oreb, and they killed the wolf at the winepress of Zeb. So these, both the rock and the winepress, are named after the men who were killed there. And they brought their heads, they brought the raven's head and the wolf's head to Gideon back on the other side of the Jordan. So that's kind of the story for today. Next week we will pick up where this story leaves off, and we'll finish out the story of Gideon and see the failure of Gideon and Israel again. Next week we'll pick up with chapter 8, and we'll see the rest of the story of Gideon. I hope you enjoyed today's story and today's lesson. In the our bishop, just so you know, this is maybe the announcements part here. In some ways, our bishop has agreed or is now allowing phase 2 openings. Not phase 3 yet, which we actually can meet, but phase 2 openings. And I know that as soon as, based on the news report, Josephine County is still in good shape. We have not had a new case since the first part of May, and we're halfway through June. And so it's been a month and a half since Josephine County, where Newman, where this class was kept or was held, has been in good shape. Josephine County. Jackson County, which is where Gold Hill, Upper Rogue, and Talent churches, my 3 churches are, is still having cases pop up every once in a while. In fact, they've just had a slight uptick in cases. So I'm not sure again, I'm still not sure as to when we're going to be able to open and start having our classes or start having services. But I'm hoping not before too long. I'm hoping that maybe in July things will start easing up a little bit, and we'll start being able to meet. But again, I don't know. I'm really hopeful for that. In the meantime, we will continue this class. Oh, and to answer a couple of questions. I received a few questions this week by email, and so I want to address that. For those of you who are new to my class, who weren't part of the original class, which is the Wednesday Bible study, I held a Wednesday Bible study at Newman United Methodist Church in Grants Pass on Wednesday afternoon at 1 o'clock from 1 to 3. It was a 2-hour class. And in that class, we had gone, the class started in 2012, and it's been going for 8 years. We've been having this class. And we got through all of the Old Testament, we got through the Apocrypha, and we got through Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and Acts, and we were moving through the epistles as this virus broke out. And so that class, the Wednesday adult Bible study that was held at 1 o'clock at Newman, again, is still on hold. It's still pending. And so that's why, and so that's where the Wednesday class, this class came from, is that I needed to start teaching again because it's what I do. It's how I fulfill my life in some ways. And so I started this Wednesday video class. I am really hopeful that when we get back together again pretty soon, that we'll be able to restart the class, pick up where we left off. We'll finish out the epistles and move on into the apocryphal and the writings of John. That's what's going to happen. So I'm hoping that answered your questions as to, first off, what I was talking about when I mentioned the Wednesday class last week. That we had a Wednesday class at Newman. And so I really don't have anything else to say. I want to thank you for attending my class today. I hope you've got something out of it. Next week we'll pick up with chapter 8 and finish out the Gideon story. And so I send you on your way. God bless you. God keep you safe, and God keep you well. And in all things, may God bless you and keep you. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord.